Ever get stuck on those like really big questions? You know, the ones that kind of just make you question like
Yeah.
everything.
Absolutely. That's kind of what philosophy is all about, right?
Yeah, exactly. And today we're tackling a huge one. It's all about how things, well, exist, how they come into being in the first place, and then how do they stick around. We're going deep into how monotheistic traditions grapple with, the whole God creating the world thing and then God like keeping it going.
I love this. And you've given us some seriously good material to work with here. The creation and conservation entry from the Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy. Talk about a classic. Any philosopher worth their salt has spent some time with this one.
Totally. So our mission today is to sort of untangle this idea of whether God creating the universe is the same or like a totally different thing from God making sure it doesn't just blink out of existence,
Yeah.
second by second. And this isn't just like some heady philosophical game either.
Oh, definitely not. This gets right to the heart of how we think about cause and effect, what time even is, pretty much the whole shebang. Essential stuff for philosophers.
Definitely. And as our source lays out, there are basically two big camps in this whole debate. One says that conservation is basically just creation happening all the time, like a never-ending poof into existence.
Right, right. And the other side, they're all about a hard line between these two acts. Creation, boom, done. Conservation, totally separate deal.
So we've got our work cut out for us today.
We do. But before we really dive in, let's just make sure we're all, speaking the same language here. We're talking about creation and conservation. For a philosopher listening, these terms can get pretty specific. So what are we actually dealing with here?
Right, good point. So when we talk about creation in this context, we're talking about like the ultimate origin story. God brings something or everything into being out of, well, nothing. Creation ex nihilo, as they say.
Okay, so from nothing, something. Got it. What about conservation then? Conservation. That's more about the upkeep. It's the divine act of making sure that whatever was created actually stays existing. Making sure it doesn't just poof disappear.
So the difference is like let there be light versus keep the lights on.
I like that. Yeah, that gets at it.
And it seems like the major monotheistic traditions, they all agree on both, right? God is the maker
Yeah.
and the maintainer.
That's right. It's the relationship between these two. That's where the real philosophical puzzle lies. It's the age-old question. Are they the same divine action happening over, different timescales, or are they totally different things that God does?
Okay, so on to the first big idea, continuous creation. Can you break that down for us? Like, what are we really getting at here in a way that makes sense for a philosopher?
Basically, it's saying that conservation isn't some separate side gig for God. It's not like God creates and then goes, okay, now time to conserve. It's
Uh-huh.
all part of the same creative flow. God's power to sustain the universe is wrapped up in the initial creative act, always going.
So it's less like flipping two different switches and more like,
More like one constant divine energy beam holding everything in existence.
exactly. Now, who are some of the big names that have, gone to bat for this idea? Give us a philosopher's roll call.
Oh, you've got some heavy hitters here. Francisco Suarez, for one.
Right.
Late scholasticism, big deal. He famously argued that creation and conservation are, get this, only conceptually distinct. Like, we can separate them in our heads, but in reality, it's all the same divine move.
I see. I see. And who else?
Then you've got Jonathan Edwards, the American theologian. Seriously influential guy. He was all about how God upholding everything, like every single moment, is the same as God creating it fresh from nothing in that very same moment. To him, the only difference is the when of it. Creation is the beginning. Conservation is like the keeping it going, but the power behind it, that's the same.
So like we're always being recreated instant by instant. That's whoa. That's a mind bender for a philosopher to think about, identity over time and all that.
Yeah, for sure. And this wasn't just some fringe idea either. Descartes, Malebranche, Leibniz, Berkeley, they were all on board with this idea in their own ways, of course, all emphasizing how God's like always there, keeping everything real.
Okay, so lots of big names. But what were the arguments? What were the philosophical moves they made to, back this up?
Well, there are a few major lines of reasoning that they used. One goes back to Aquinas and his idea of like divine atemporality.
Ah, Aquinas. Always a good place to start for a philosopher.
Right. So the idea is that for God, there's no past, present, or future. Everything is just this eternal now. So when God gives existence, it's not like a one-time thing that's over and done with. It's this constant, unchanging action. Aquinas even uses the analogy of sunlight hitting the air. The light's there because the sun's constantly shining. The action doesn't stop, even though we experience the effect, the light, as something that's happening in time.
So creation isn't like a past event for God. It's this always happening now that fuels everything, that really messes with our linear idea of cause and effect, huh?
Totally. But even Aquinas, and this is important, even he didn't think that meant God. Like, micromanages everything. He believed in secondary causes. The whole web of how things depend on other things in the created order. It's just that everything ultimately is rooted in God's sustaining power.
Right, right. So there's still room for things to, like, actually happen in the world, for things to have effects. Important for any philosopher interested in, how we explain things, the philosophy of science and all.
Yeah.
What else did they argue?
Well, Suarez had a big one. He argued that if creation and conservation were really two different things, then conservation would have to, last for the entire lifetime of, well, whatever's being conserved. And if that's true, he said, then why couldn't creation itself just be designed to last that long too? Like, why have two separate actions if one could do the whole job?
Right, I'm following you.
He really stressed that the effect, the thing continuing to exist, and the cause, God, are the same in both scenarios. Even Descartes called this a, commonly held theological view. It really appealed to the philosophical idea of, not overcomplicating things.
Like, don't multiply entities beyond necessity, right? Classic philosophical principle.
Exactly. For Suarez, conservation is basically creation happening again and again in every moment. There's no thing for God to act on to conserve it. It's more like a new instance of being from nothing every time.
Okay, that actually leads into that third argument, the whole can things even keep themselves existing bit. That seems pretty basic to a lot of philosophical traditions.
Oh, absolutely. This is where Descartes and Edwards really shine. Descartes, in his Principles of Philosophy, argues that time itself, the fact that moments are all separate, means that just because something exists now doesn't automatically mean it's going to exist the next moment. We need a continuous cause, the same one that kicked things off to, as he put it, reproduce us in each new moment. We just don't have the power within ourselves to keep existing.
So it's not that we're built to last, it's that we're constantly being rebuilt by God.
Exactly. And Edwards is right there with him, arguing that a cause can't do anything in a time or place where it doesn't exist. So the fact that we existed in the past can't be what's making us exist right now. God's got to be in on it, actively preserving us. It's not just similar to creation, it's the same thing happening all the time. He even went as far as to say that our identity over time, the me, that's the same from one moment to the next. That's not some inherent thing. It's all down to God's will.
Wow. That has some pretty serious implications for philosophers thinking about, who we are and whether we really persist over time. It makes us seem, well, even more dependent on God than some might be comfortable with.
For sure. And, the entry points out that some philosophers have seen this part of Edwards' view as, well, a little bit of a problem. Like it maybe weakens the whole idea of us really enduring through time. But more recently, Kvanvig and McCann have actually come in strong on this point that we can't keep ourselves going. They argue that we don't have some special self-sustaining power built into us, and we definitely can't, time travel our causal powers into the future. If something stops existing, it can't cause anything anymore, so we can't, push ourselves into future existence.
Okay, so that's continuous creation. What about the other side? What are the big arguments for keeping creation and conservation separate?
So the main idea here is that there's this fundamental difference between bringing something into existence from literally nothing and keeping something that already exists, going. Conservation just assumes that there's already something there for God to act on, something that wasn't there during creation. That's a big deal for philosophers who think about the nature of action and what it acts on.
It's like the difference between building a house from scratch and doing regular maintenance to keep it from falling apart.
Yeah, exactly. And one of the main arguments for this difference hinges on the whole issue of secondary causation. The idea that created things can actually do stuff, cause effects in the world.
Right, because if God's constantly recreating everything from scratch, doesn't that make creatures kind of irrelevant? Can we really do anything if God's calling all the shots all the time? Big question for a philosopher.
Right. If God's the one making the world exist and everything in it, moment by moment, what room is there left for us to, actually be agents in the world? This gets into the whole debate about occasionalism.
Occasionalism. Oh, yeah, that's a fun one. So for anyone just tuning in, occasionalism is this idea that God is the only real cause and everything else is just a cue for God to act. Like fire doesn't actually burn stuff. God causes the burning when there's fire around.
Right, right. And Craig actually brings this up in relation to continuous creation, especially the more extreme versions. He sees a link between the two. And it's not like this is some new idea either. Some Islamic thinkers, like the Ash'arites back in the medieval period, they were all about attributing all agency to God.
So a world where God's constantly pulling all the strings and we're just puppets.
Kind of, yeah. Now, big thinkers like Aquinas and Suarez, they tried to find a middle ground, a way to keep both continuous creation and secondary causes. But even they admitted it was tricky to make work. If creatures can't even keep themselves existing, as some continuous creationists say, then it's hard to see how they could have any real power to affect anything else.
Yeah, it's like if God's always intervening at the most basic level, there's not much space for the natural world to, do its thing.
Right. But Quinn has a really interesting counterargument here. He says that, okay, maybe God is the ultimate cause of existence, but that doesn't mean creatures can't do anything. Like, think about boiling water. God provides the water, right? But you need a lit match to get the heat going. It's a collaboration.
Ah, so God sets the stage, but we get to, move the furniture around.
Yeah, something like that. It's a really clever way to keep God in charge without turning everything into a deterministic puppet show.
I like it. But hold on. Doesn't Pavlich have something to say about this whole secondary causation thing? I remember something about a first moment objection.
Oh, right, Pavlich. He's sharp. His point is that, right at the moment of creation, nothing had any pre-existing powers to do anything. It was all just God's creative oomph. But if every moment is a fresh creation, then every moment is kind of like that first moment. So at no point can creatures really have independent power to cause stuff.
So no matter how you slice it, we're back to puppets.
It's a tough one for sure. One way around this that Pavlich even considers is to say that, okay, maybe things don't have causal powers the instant they come into being, but they can develop them over time, right? The fact that there are earlier moments kind of creates a space for causal powers to emerge. But this doesn't really work for someone like Edwards, who is adamant that a cause can only act when and where it exists. No exceptions.
Okay, so secondary causation, that's one big argument. What's next on the list for separating creation and conservation?
The persistence of things. This one gets deep into how we understand, what it means for something to be the same thing over time.
Ah, identity over time. Classic philosophical puzzle. Love it.
So the key idea here is that for something to truly persist, for it to be the same thing from one moment to the next, there has to be some connection between its existence at those different times. If there's no link, then it's not really the same thing. It's just a bunch of similar things popping up one after another.
Like a series of identical twins instead of the same person aging.
Exactly. And this is where continuous creation runs into trouble. If God's creating everything fresh at every moment, then there's no real link between what exists at one moment and what exists at the next. Craig asks this great question. Is it really the same thing persisting or just a bunch of copies?
Yeah, it's like if there's nothing for God to act on, like no existing thing to conserve, then are we really persisting?
Right. It challenges the whole idea of, enduring through time. And for a lot of philosophers, especially those thinking about personal identity, that's a huge problem.
Right. So continuous creation might actually lead to a world where everything is constantly flickering in and out of existence, no real continuity.
Which is a pretty wild thought.
It is.
Yeah.
How do continuous creationists, respond to that?
Well, Quinn tries to address it by making a distinction between bringing something into being and introducing, which can only happen once. He says that you can only introduce something once, but you can create multiple instances of the same type of thing.
Okay, so you can create a new type of cookie once, but you can bake batches of that same cookie over and over.
Yeah, something like that. But, even if the distinction works, it still doesn't feel like it captures the connectedness we think about when we talk about things persisting over time, especially for things like, people. We have memories, goals, a sense of self that goes beyond just being the same type of thing.
Right. It's not just about being a human. It's about being this particular human with all my history and baggage.
Exactly. And the entry does mention temporal parts theory as a possible way for continuous creationists to, get around this.
Oh, right. Temporal parts. Explain that one to the folks at home.
So the idea is that things aren't wholly present at every moment of their existence. Instead, they're made up of these temporal slices, stages that exist at different times. Vallicella suggests that, maybe an occasionalist or a continuous creationist could use this to say that things do persist just in a different way. Even if God's making each of these temporal parts from nothing, it's the sequence of those parts that makes up the thing as a whole.
So it's like instead of a single enduring object, it's like a flip book of like momentary existences, and the flip book as a whole is the thing.
Yeah, that's a good way to put it. But van der Laan pushes back on this, saying that just having a bunch of similar parts lined up doesn't really give you the kind of persistence we see in things like, people, especially with our inner lives, how our experiences are connected over time.
So a bunch of snapshots doesn't equal a life story, basically.
Yeah, van der Laan suggests that maybe what makes the difference between just being replaced each moment and actually persisting is a specific act of God's will, like a divine "this is the same thing" decree.
A metaphysical stamp of approval.
Right. Or, if you're really committed to the idea that there needs to be some causal link between moments, he explores these models where God's sustaining action either works with the creature's own, limited ability to continue existing, or where God kind of sets things up so that the creature causes its own continued existence. It gets pretty complex, but it shows how philosophers are trying to really make sense of this.
Yeah, some serious metaphysical acrobatics there.
Yeah.
Okay, so we've got the persistence problem. What's the third big argument against lumping creation and conservation together?
Time. This one's a doozy because it challenges the whole idea of what time even is.
Always a good challenge for a philosopher.
Pavlich argues that if you really take continuous creation seriously, you end up with some pretty weird implications for time. He says that for time to be real, it needs to have a kind of built-in flow, this temporal inertia where moments follow each other naturally and things keep existing within that flow. But if every moment and everything in those moments depends on God's direct action, then there's no natural flow anymore. It's all just God's decisions.
So no inherent connection between moments, no arrow of time, just God's cosmic playlist on shuffle.
Yeah, kind of. And it gets even weirder. Pavlich says that in this view, before and after only makes sense because of God's actions. Time only exists because God creates. It's not something that's there beforehand, which for a philosopher who's used to thinking about time as, the backdrop for everything, that's pretty mind-blowing.
Yeah, hard to wrap your head around that one. How do continuous creationists deal with this?
Well, Pavlich actually anticipates some of the responses. One is to just say that, look, maybe time doesn't need this temporal inertia thing. Maybe it can be real without that. Others might argue that time's flow actually comes from God's constant creating. The order of God's actions is what creates the order of time. And then there's the idea that, maybe there's a kind of God time that's different from our time, and that God's actions happen within that time.
So a higher level time that our time is embedded in.
Yeah, kind of like nested timelines, I guess. But Pavlich pushes back on all of these. He argues that even with a God time, if the moments of our time only exist because of God's actions, they're not really connected in a way that makes for real time, They're just isolated snapshots.
That's a tricky one. Okay, so that's time. What's the final argument for separating creation and conservation?
This one goes back to the actions themselves, looking at how they're different. It's the who's being acted on argument.
Back to basics. Always a good move for a philosopher.
Right. So Craig says that there's this really intuitive difference between the two actions. Conservation, by definition, has something it's acting on, like the thing that's being conserved. But creation brings something into being from nothing. There's nothing there to act on beforehand.
Okay, that makes sense. To conserve is to keep something going. To create is to make the something in the first place.
Exactly. And because of this difference, he argues, they can't be the same action. He also points out that creation is instantaneous, it happens all at once, but conservation has to happen over time, right? It's about keeping something going. So they have different structures, different timelines. That makes them distinct in his view.
Okay, so there's something intuitively different about acting on something versus making something to act on. That makes sense for a philosopher thinking about, actions and what they're directed at.
Totally. But even this view, the agent-patient theory of conservation, it has its problems. Vallicella argues that if this is right, then God couldn't even start conserving something at the exact moment it's created because the thing wouldn't exist yet. And if conservation starts after creation, well, then the thing had to exist for a bit without being conserved, which is a bit of a paradox.
So when exactly does conservation kick in? That's a good question.
Right. And then Miller points out another problem. He says that this view has trouble explaining how conservation can be continuous without either doing the same thing over and over, which is kind of redundant, or leaving gaps where things aren't being conserved. If the first act of conservation is enough to keep something going for a while, why are more acts needed?
So continuous conservation seems to be either overkill or like a leaky bucket.
Pretty much. So as we've seen, both sides have really good points, and they both run into some pretty tricky philosophical knots.
Yeah, this whole thing started with what seemed like a simple question, but it's clear that it gets really complicated really fast.
Absolutely. It takes us right to the heart of some of the biggest questions in philosophy, like the nature of God, how causality works, what time even is, and what it means for anything to, really exist over time.
Exactly. And like the Stanford Encyclopedia entry says, which view you end up finding more convincing, it really comes down to your own philosophical starting points, you
Yeah,
know?
totally. Your ideas about God, how cause and effect work, your whole metaphysics of time and persistence, all of that plays into which side of this debate seems right to you.
So to our philosopher friends out there listening, here's something to chew on. Which arguments resonate most with you? Does it make more sense to think about the universe as being constantly created? Or does it feel more right to say that there's a separate act of like divine maintenance going on? These are big questions, and the way you answer them shapes how you see, well, everything.